Oh yeah, look up in there too, dude. Look at those rubs up in there. Oh my goodness. They're everywhere. This might be a little bed right here. Oh, that's cool, dude. It's cool. Tyler, what is this?
This is a rub.
Hot diggity dogs.
This is not a scrape, right,
No,
Casey?
this is not a scrape. They do scrape their antlers on it, but this is not a scrape. We have another video where we talk specifically about scrapes on the ground, but this is a rub on a plum tree in a plum thicket. There's a couple more back through here that we didn't discover until we started crawling around in here. But
how's it made?
This is made with deer taking their antlers and rubbing / scraping their antlers along the tree to remove the bark.
So not does.
Not does. Bucks do this.
Yep.
Yes, antlered critters. A lot of times whenever you see a freak antlered doe shot, they have velvet on their antlers because they don't have the testosterone that makes them want to do this. So I think that kind of does roll us into the idea of why deer make rubs. Tyler, why do deer make rubs?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I do think there's a communication factor that could be noted here. I think it's saying...
It sticks out. It's very visual.
Yes.
Right?
I mean, this dude can see them from hundreds of yards away. Sometimes he'll be like, hey, there's a rub. And I'll be like, okay. And I'm looking, I don't see it. We'll walk 100 yards before we get to that thing. I don't know how he does it. But the rubs are made as a communication sign of sorts that let other bucks and does know, like, hey, there's a dude in here. Like, there's a dude. It's like when a dude walks into a bar or wherever with a tight shirt on and he's got some big old biceps, he's saying, hey, y'all recognize I'm in here. You know what I mean? So that's kind of like what is happening here. But I think there's also a sort of chemical thing that's happening in the body that makes them do this, right?
It's like an aggressive thing. Like whenever guys are young and in their 20s, they like to lift weights a lot of times, at least the macho types, right? Like the man kind of guys. And deer are really not that much different. You know, their testosterone comes and wanes depending on the time of the year. As September gets here, they've grown their antlers through the summer, and that testosterone starts hitting their body, and they kind of have to have outlets for that. And that a lot of times is translated into rub action. And I don't really know for sure on the biology of this. I'm not a biologist, guys, but I am a hunter and I observe things. And I think that, of course, there's got to be some level of strength that comes along with it as well. It's somewhat like weight training for deer. You know, you see them pushing hard. Like this tree it's pretty heavy, and it takes a lot of force to make that happen. This is down into the hardwood, right? So he is not just kind of whipping around. He's getting into that thing, right?
Yeah.
So it also probably has some level of preparation for fights with other deer because they know the rut. Well, they don't know the rut is coming, but their body is telling them the rut is coming.
They're mad at other bucks.
They're mad at stuff, right?
They're building their muscles up in their neck.
Yeah. And another reason that deer make rubs, although it's smaller, is that they do sometimes use the rub to help shed the velvet off of their antlers that time of year. Now, there is one other particular instance where deer make rubs year after year called signpost rubs, right?
Yep. So a signpost rub is, like you said, perennial. It happens year after year, and there's a way to tell the difference. This has been made this year, so and we can tell that because of the color of the wood. Also, the other thing that separates it from a signpost rub is what you'll see is a lot of times when you see a signpost rub is you see where there's kind of like, it's not the bark, but it's like wood that has grown over the center piece of the wood. So there's like
it's like the tree healing.
Yes,
kinda.
It's the tree healing, and it's so like it's growing, it's trying to close back in, and then it gets hit again, right? And it's rubbed over the top of that stuff too, and that's how you know it's a signpost rub, which can alert us to a few different things, such as the fact that this tree sits in a place that deer tend to frequent for
especially during November during the rut.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So we talked about kind of like why they rub, what they do with those rubs. And let's talk about like what we can learn from the different types of rubs, and then also how we can hunt that as well.
Yeah. So the different types of rubs that you might see is like we just talked about, the signpost rub, but then also these rubs here, if you look, there's further back, like we said, that we just started seeing within this thicket, almost have to be bedding rubs. We came in on a trail, and that would make you think that this buck turned to his left and rubbed this tree, and then kind of went back in and bedded up back in there around those other rubs. Now, you can see that kind of on the entrance trail. You can also see it in the places that they stand up in their bed. Like it might be kind of a stretching thing that they do in bedding rubs. They get up, you know, kind of flex their muscles, puff their hair up a little bit, and rub on trees.
You also see, well, so also in the bedding side of things here, like you see different types of habitat or fauna or flora that you would assume is a bedding thicket, right? So like this plum thicket sets up to be a place that there's bedding. I see another rub right there. And so, you know, we see that also a lot, like in Texas, East Texas especially, we see privet thickets will be places that deer would like to bed. It's high stem count, little stems, lots of them, and a deer will have a whole bunch of them rubbed out in a, you know, small little area around his bed where, like you said, he stands up and he rubs. So that's kind of the bedding rubs. There are different types of rubs than just the signpost and the bedding rubs.
You found a rub while ago up on a oak flat, right?
Yep.
Tell us about that.
So it was a little knob where there was a group of post oaks. And we know a little bit about post oaks. We know that those oaks are probably dropping in October. They're dropping acorns in October. So you can assume, based off of that, just that knowledge, that rub was probably made in October. But we also found that, as you can see here, this bark is kind of orange and brightly colored brown, right?
It's what I call a wet rub.
Yeah, he calls them a wet rub. This was more of a dry rub, I guess is what you call it, right?
Kind of like barbecue type thing. Yeah.
That rub in particular was a lot more black, less brown, and the bark wasn't as, or the inside wasn't as orange and kind of brown. It was more white colored.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that tells you it's been several months since that was made. So in postseason, you can identify these rubs when they were made, and then also that kind of helps you in hunting. But there is another type of rub that we want to talk about as well, that has to do with like funnels or pinch points, and the signpost tends to be there too a lot of times.
Yeah, signpost tends to be there. Are you kind of alluding to like rub lines? Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Rub lines, and also like just a random rub. There's a couple of them. Rubs, but like a random rub, but it's on a trail. It's in a high use place. So a lot of deer are coming through this trail, right? It's a great trail, and he'll hit a signpost type of rub. It's not always that it's been there year after year, but a lot of times is a big tree that sticks out right on the trail.
Kind of just an aggression type rub.
Yeah, it's like, hey, I'm smelling all kinds of deer up and down this trail, and I'm kind of happy.
I just want to do something about it, right?
Yep.
And then if you've hunted for a while or you've been around old hunters, rub lines are it's like a tactic, like one of the first tactics that people used, right? I'm gonna go hunt that rub line over there. He's been using that rub line, and there's some truth to that. I think there's something to it, but I don't think that deer intentionally make a line of rubs and it be something that they intend to do. I think that rub lines indicate that it's a high usage area, and that buck didn't go through there and make every single one of those every day, take 15 minutes and just only go like 100 yards in an hour, right? I think that rub line shows you that there's a buck using that consistently at some point in the year, and you can kind of take that information in postseason scouting, look at kind of how aged the rub is, how wet it is. If it's real wet, he might have been doing that late in the season. If it's like this right here says a November rub to me. That's just right there at it. It's early February right now. This thing is starting to dry out, but I'd still call it a wet rub. It's not an early season rub by any means. And if you find that in a rub line, you kind of know that that's when that buck was there. A lot of times rub lines can end up being all different variances of rubs because a deer uses an area all season. And when you see that, it's kind of also an indicator that maybe there wasn't a ton of hunter pressure in the area, and that deer was able to stay in that area for most of the season and have all his needs met, whether it's food, water, and shelter. So if you find a rub line, it's really something to take note of. Yeah. Another reason that you might find a rub line is that we found one as soon as we came into this property, right? And it was on a habitat transition. The habitat transition actually was the road, right? The thicket backs up to the road, and there's a rub line 20 yards in from the fence line. That is probably from a buck cruising the south end of that thicket, smelling for does often and rubbing while he is cruising that thicket. Yeah,
there's also another place that we see rubs a lot, which is in some kind of staging right before they go to a destination food source. And what it is more than anything is that deer stalls out. He got there too early maybe and didn't want to go out in the daylight, and he stalls out and has nothing to do but rub and lick and smell everything, right? And so that we'll see a lot of rubs in a little area.
It's almost like they're bored.
Yeah.
Need something to do, right?
Yeah.
They ain't got cell phones to get on and check things out, so they just kind of go to messing around.
Exactly
and
right.
you can end up finding kind of the wispy type rubs and stuff like that in that situation where it's like you can't really make a lot of rhyme or reason from it, but you can tell that there's staging going on there, and it's a good place to catch a buck in daylight.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's talk about this real quick. I want to ask you this question. Can you tell the size of a buck from the size of a rub? Or from a rub, period?
I think yes and no. I think that in this situation where we're at in here with this, low ceiling of cover, that it'd be pretty tough to tell the size of this buck. I think that since he picked out some of the bigger trees, it's probably a decent sized buck, but it's hard to judge him by the height of the rub. But I do like to look at the height of rubs. I'm not a tape measure guy or anything, but like when I see a rub that's made it up to like my chest, I know that's a big buck. Now, when I see a little bitty tree like this that's just kind of torn to shreds, that could be a 1.5 up to a big old toothless sucker. Like you just don't know really what did that. Now, there is one rub that I really can tell the age of a deer from. That's when you see a tree like this that's just got a little bitty something right there. That is a little tiny, is what that is.
Because you can tell because something with some mass behind him would just tear it up, but it's not torn up. It's just barely rubbed. There's not a whole lot of testosterone and aggression in that, right? So let's talk about how we would hunt rubs. I mean, you and I are not necessarily big fans of hunting rubs in particular, but there are instances, right?
Yeah, there are instances. I think that signpost rub is a situation where you could actually set up to shoot a deer in daylight over a rub, but that signpost rub tells you a lot more than just a rub there, right? You know that there's high deer activity and bucks frequenting the area. Do you have any other things that you can take from as a hunter for rubs?
Yeah, so for instance, that rub that I saw there, by the oaks is something that you could say, well, there's deer or bucks using this area, in October. It'd be a place I'd hang a camera probably first, and a lot of these might be places we would hang cameras first. One thing that Brian told us as well here running the camera is that what a buck or what a rub will tell you is that there are bucks in the area. So if you see a rub line, there's a deer that's typically either frequenting that area or or maybe even slowing down in that area, right? So it could be staging like we talked about earlier. So potentially, if you couple that with some other reasons that give you a good, other things that give you a good reason to hunt there, then I think definitely it's worth hunting over rubs. But you definitely want to, I think, couple that with different habitat.
Yes, I think rubs are a huge piece of the puzzle, but definitely not like a scrape that you can point out and say, I'm hunting that scrape. However, I think that you can also tell direction of travel from rubs a lot. Like this one right here. The bark on this back side of this rub here is not rubbed at all. It's rubbed on this front side. I mentioned when we first came in that I think the deer came in this access trail, turned to his left, and rubbed that. Now, this is kind of a tight, close quarter scenario, but you can find a rub in the middle of the woods and tell which direction the deer came from if it is missing or missing bark on one side and not on the other.
We did that in Arkansas, actually.
Really?
So we hunted a big ridge system that had a finger ridge that came off of it, and as it leaked off, you could tell that bucks were coming off of that ridge and rubbing, but there was no rub as they were going back up. So what I was thinking is that bucks were coming off the ridge system down to a destination food source, therefore setting up on that and hunting an evening made sense to me, and we were in there in the evening. So when I saw that, I said, this is a spot right here. We hunted it, saw some turkeys, no deer, but that's a whole different story. But I definitely think it was a good spot for us to set up, and that you can tell the direction and you can base that off of where the food destination is, where the bedding might be, to help you plan your game, whether it's morning or evening, right?
Yeah, and I think that kind of do a broader picture here with that, deer don't really walk linearly. I don't think that when you think of bed to food, you kind of think back and forth. And I don't think that's what bucks do very often. I think they're making a lot of circles or a lot of figure eights, or they're doing something to cover more ground, especially in the rut, because they're trying to take in as much scent as possible to see where the hot does are. And I think that that's where the direction of the rub kind of helps you as well, because if you can set up and say, like, you know where a food source is, you know where some bedding is, and you see the rubs on the food source side, you can almost assume that that deer is using that area in the morning as opposed to in the evening, and vice versa, depending on the hunting situation. It can help you plan your hunt and your access routes.
So hopefully this postseason scouting tip has helped you out a lot and will help you in the future to shoot more bucks. If you want, you can check out the link in the description below or the links to see more of our postseason scouting stuff.